It all began with a dinner invitation, a bizarre, out-of-the-blue request that had me questioning everything. Rachel, my wife of 10 years, had asked me to join her and a group of colleagues for a company event at a restaurant downtown. Nothing about it seemed strange on the surface, except for one thing: Rachel never wanted me at her work functions. She always insisted they were boring, all shop talk, and that I wouldn't enjoy myself. But this time, she was insistent, almost uncharacteristically eager. "Come on, Adam," she said, flashing that dazzling smile I fell in love with years ago. "It's going to be fun, and William's hosting. He's a great guy, you'll like him." William. I'd heard that name before, her boss. The one she always spoke about with a mix of admiration and vague annoyance. I'd never met him, but from what she told me, he was charming, confident, and, if I'm being honest, just a little too interesting for my comfort. Still, I didn't think much of it. She was proud of her job and loved impressing her superiors. Maybe she wanted to show me off for a change. So, I agreed. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place I'd only been to once or twice, usually for big anniversaries. Rachel was in her element, laughing, chatting, and gesturing with her wineglass like she owned the room. I hung back, nursing a whiskey, trying to look engaged. But something felt off. Then I saw it. A glance. Subtle, but unmistakable. Rachel and William were at the head of the table, deep in conversation. She leaned in, her hand brushing his arm as she laughed at something he said. It wasn't the gesture that caught my attention, it was the way he looked at her. Like she wasn't just another employee. Like he knew something I didn't. The rest of the evening blurred. The conversations felt shallow, the laughter forced. Every time Rachel turned to me, she wore the mask of a devoted wife, but my gut told me there was something beneath it. Something darker. After dessert, William stood to make a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. His eyes flickered to Rachel, just for a second, but it was enough. She looked down, her cheeks flushing as she clinked her glass with mine. When we got home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just witnessed the opening act of a play I wasn't supposed to be a part of. Rachel seemed tired but unusually cheerful as she slipped off her heels and headed to the bedroom. I stayed in the living room, staring at the empty whiskey glass in my hand. There was something about that dinner, that look, that toast. Something gnawing at me. I didn't know it yet, but I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath me was starting to crumble. The next morning started like any other, but the tension in my chest hadn't eased. Rachel was already dressed, sipping her coffee while scrolling through her laptop. The usual. She barely looked up when I walked into the kitchen, just a distracted morning before going back to whatever she was reading. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat across from her. The dinner from the night before nagged at me, but I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding paranoid. Rachel was sharp, quick to dismiss anything she considered baseless. If I accused her of something without proof, she'd swat it away before I could finish the sentence. So, I stayed quiet, watching her out of the corner of my eye. "Busy day ahead?" I asked, more to break the silence than out of real curiosity. "Yeah," she said without looking up. "William wants me to prep for the quarterly review. Might be a late one tonight." There it was again, his name, dropped casually like a pebble in water. But this time, I paid closer attention. Her tone, her body language. She didn't sound annoyed, as she usually did when talking about work. She sounded comfortable. I left for work feeling restless. As a contractor, I spent most of my day on site, surrounded by sawdust and the steady hum of power tools. It was the perfect environment for overthinking, and I did plenty of that. Images of Rachel and William kept flashing in my mind, his hand brushing hers, that knowing look during the toast. By lunchtime, I decided I needed answers. When I got home, Rachel wasn't there. I wasn't surprised, she'd said it would be a late night. Her absence gave me the perfect opportunity to snoop. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed to know if my gut feeling was paranoia or something more. I started with her laptop. It was password protected, but Rachel wasn't exactly a tech wizard. After 3 attempts, I guessed right, our wedding anniversary. I felt a pang of guilt as the desktop loaded, but I pushed it aside. This wasn't about invading her privacy. It was about understanding what was going on in my own marriage. Her browser history was clean. Too clean. Either she was unnaturally disciplined about clearing it, or she was hiding something. I checked her email next, scrolling through page after page of mundane work correspondence. It felt like a dead end until I stumbled on a thread marked confidential, special project. The email chain was between Rachel and William. It started off innocently enough: logistics, schedules, project updates. But then I noticed something odd. Attached to one of the emails was a hotel reservation. I opened it, my pulse quickening. It was for a boutique hotel downtown, booked for 2 nights. Under guests, it listed Rachel's name and William's. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. The dates were last month, during one of Rachel's so-called business trips. I felt a rush of nausea, like the floor had been ripped out from under me. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. I shut the laptop and sat back, my heart pounding. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but she wasn't home. I needed more, something concrete I could throw in her face without giving her a chance to lie her way out of it. That's when I remembered the camera. A few months ago, I'd installed a security camera in our living room after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. Rachel hadn't been thrilled about it, saying it felt like overkill, but I insisted. Now, it felt like a lifeline. I logged into the camera's feed and scrolled back to the dates on the hotel reservation. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. On the first night, the footage showed Rachel walking through the front door, suitcase in hand. Around 11 p.m. less than a minute later, William appeared, carrying his own bag. They laughed about something as they walked into the kitchen, and then the feed went dark. She must have turned off the camera. My hands clenched into fists as I stared at the screen. There it was, undeniable proof. I didn't need to see what happened after that. I already knew. Rachel didn't come home until after midnight. I was sitting in the living room, waiting, the evidence still fresh in my mind. When she walked in, she looked surprised to see me. "You're up late," she said, kicking off her heels. I didn't respond. My eyes were locked on her, unblinking. For a moment, she looked uncomfortable, but then her usual confidence returned. "Everything okay?" she asked, setting her bag down. "Do you want to tell me about William?" I said, my voice steady but cold. Her eyes flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. She laughed nervously. "What about him?" "He's my boss." "Why?" I stood up, holding her laptop in one hand and my phone in the other. "Don't play dumb, Rachel. I saw the emails. The hotel reservation. And the footage from the camera. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about." Her face went pale, the blood draining from her cheeks. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then, she tried to recover, her voice rising in indignation. "You were snooping through my stuff," she demanded, deflecting like a seasoned pro. "How dare you invade my privacy?" "Don't," I said sharply, cutting her off. "Don't try to turn this around on me. I know what you did. Now, either you tell me the truth, or I'm done here." The room was dead silent except for the sound of her breathing. She opened her mouth to speak but then closed it, as if weighing her options. Finally, she sat down on the couch, her shoulders slumping. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "Then what is it, Rachel? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, and for the first time in years, I saw her cry. But her tears didn't move me. Not anymore. All I wanted was the truth, no matter how ugly it was. And I was about to get it. Rachel's sobbing filled the silence of the room, but I wasn't moved. If anything, her tears felt more like a stall tactic than remorse. I stayed standing, towering over her as she hunched on the couch, her hands hiding her face. "Enough," I said sharply. "Cut the theatrics. Just tell me the truth, Rachel. How long has this been going on? She looked up at me, her mascara smudged, her eyes wide with desperation. It's not what you think, she said again, her voice trembling. I leaned forward, planting my hands on the coffee table between us. What exactly do I think, Rachel? That my wife of 10 years has been sneaking off to hotels with her boss for business meetings? That you laugh and drink wine with him at dinners while I sit at home like a fool, trusting you? That's not what I think, that's what I know. So, save me the bullshit and give me some real answers. She flinched at my words but didn't respond immediately. I could see her working through her options, weighing what she could say to salvage the situation. Finally, she sighed and straightened up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. It wasn't like that, she began, her voice low. It was complicated. Complicated? I repeated, my voice rising. What's complicated about sneaking around behind my back? Was it complicated when you booked that hotel? When you invited him into our house? Or when you turned off the camera so I wouldn't see what happened next? Her eyes widened in shock, and I knew I had hit a nerve. She hadn't realized I'd seen the footage. For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth slightly open. Then, her expression hardened. Fine, she snapped. You want the truth? Yes, I was with William. But it wasn't about you. It was about me. I'd been feeling trapped. Stifled. I needed something to remind me that I'm still alive. I felt a surge of anger so intense that I had to step back to keep from losing control. Trapped? I repeated, my voice shaking. Stifled? You're blaming me for this? I've worked my ass off to give you a good life, to support you in everything you do, and this is how you repay me? By screwing your boss? It wasn't like that, she shouted, standing up now, her fists clenched at her sides. It wasn't about you, Adam. I told you it was about me. I was lonely. You're always so busy with work, with your projects. And William, he noticed me. He made me feel important. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. Instead, I turned and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. My hands were trembling, and I clenched them into fists to steady myself. Do you even hear yourself? I asked finally, my voice low and steady. You're justifying cheating on me because I was working to provide for us? Because I trusted you enough to believe you were where you said you'd be, doing what you said you were doing? And now you want to make this about your feelings? She didn't respond, but I could hear her breathing heavily behind me. When I turned back around, her face was red, and she was glaring at me. You don't understand, she said through gritted teeth. You never do. You think everything is so black and white, but it's not. I didn't mean for it to happen, Adam. It just did. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that surprised even me. It just happened? Are you kidding me? You don't just happen to book hotel rooms or sneak a man into your house. You don't just happen to lie to your husband for months. That takes effort, Rachel. Planning. Intent. Her glare faltered, and for the first time, I saw something resembling shame in her expression. But it wasn't enough. It was too late for that. So, what now? I asked, crossing my arms. Do you love him? Are you leaving me for him? Or was this just some midlife crisis fling to feel alive? She hesitated, and I could see the gears turning in her head. Finally, she shook her head. I don't love him, she said quietly. It wasn't about love. It was a mistake. A stupid, horrible mistake. I laughed again, shaking my head. A mistake, I repeated. That's the best you can do? A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk on your way home. What you did was a choice, Rachel. A conscious decision to betray me, to betray our marriage. Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed your trust. But I want to fix this, Adam. I want us to work through this. I stared at her, incredulous. You want to fix this? After everything you've done, you think you can just say you're sorry and we'll go back to the way things were? I'll do anything, she said, her voice breaking. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I'll cut ties with William, leave my job, whatever you want. Just, don't give up on us. Her desperation was palpable, but it only fueled my anger. You think you get to dictate the terms now? I asked, my voice cold. You don't. You gave up that right the moment you let him into your life, into our life. The room fell silent, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy between us. I could see the realization dawning on her face that no amount of apologies or promises would undo the damage she had done. I need time, I said finally, my voice firm. Time to figure out what I want, what I can live with. But for now, you're staying in the guest room. And don't think for a second that this conversation is over. Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't argue. She stood and walked silently to the bedroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As the door closed behind her, I sank into the armchair, exhausted but unable to rest. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of our marriage, every sign I had missed. I had the truth now, but it brought no relief. Only anger, betrayal, and the burning question of what to do next. The house was eerily quiet after Rachel retreated to the guest room. I sat in the living room for hours, replaying the confrontation in my mind. Every word, every excuse she gave, only fueled the fire of my anger. I wanted her to feel what I felt, the crushing betrayal, the humiliation. But more than that, I wanted control of the situation, of my life, back. By morning, I had a plan. This wasn't going to be one of those situations where I let her off easy. No, Rachel was going to experience consequences, and they'd hit her where it hurt the most. The first step was practical, securing evidence. I'd already uncovered the emails, hotel reservations, and security footage, but I needed more. Rachel thought she could play the victim, spin a narrative where her actions were the result of emotional neglect. I wasn't going to let that happen. I spent the day gathering everything. I copied emails, downloaded the security footage, and even backed up messages from her laptop. Each file went into a neatly labeled folder on a USB drive, which I placed in the safe in my office. This wasn't just about protecting myself in case of a divorce, it was about leverage. When Rachel emerged from the guest room late that afternoon, she looked disheveled. Her eyes were red and puffy, but I felt no sympathy. We need to talk, she said hesitantly. I held up a hand. Not yet. I've got things to do. You'll hear from me when I'm ready. She looked taken aback but didn't argue. Good. She was starting to understand that this wasn't on her terms anymore. Step 2, strategy. I called my lawyer, a no-nonsense bulldog named Eric. I laid everything out for him, the evidence, the affair, my goals. Eric didn't sugarcoat anything. If this goes to court, we'll need airtight documentation, he said. Judges don't like messy, emotional cases. You've got a good shot at coming out ahead, but only if we handle this carefully. I nodded, jotting down his advice. What about the house? I asked. And the kids? Eric leaned back in his chair. Do you want to keep the house? I thought about it for a moment. The house was ours, built with my own 2 hands, room by room. But now, it felt tainted. I could see William's shadow in every corner. The thought of staying there while Rachel walked around pretending nothing had changed was unbearable. I want it sold, I said finally. Split the proceeds. She can find her own place. And the kids? Eric pressed. With me, I said firmly. Rachel can see them, but I want full custody. She made her choices, and I'm not letting her instability affect them. Eric nodded, scribbling notes. Good. This isn't going to be easy, Adam. But if we play it smart, you'll come out of this stronger. Step 3, execution. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen where Rachel was nursing a cup of coffee. She looked up, her eyes hopeful, but I cut her off before she could speak. I've spoken to a lawyer, I said bluntly. This is what's happening, we're selling the house. I'm filing for full custody of the kids. And you're moving out as soon as we figure out the logistics. Her jaw dropped. Adam, wait. We can work through this. No, I interrupted. You made that impossible. I'm not interested in counseling or reconciliation. This is how it's going to be. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. You're being unfair, she said, her voice rising. I made a mistake, yes, but this? This is cruel. Cruel? I repeated, laughing bitterly. You want to talk about cruel? Do you have any idea what it feels like to find out your wife of 10 years has been sneaking around with her boss? To know that while I was working my ass off for this family, you were throwing it all away for what? A fling? She flinched but didn't back down. It wasn't a fling, she said quietly. And it wasn't about you. Spare me this speech, I snapped. This isn't up for debate. I've made my decision. Step 4, Exposure. I didn't intend to keep Rachel's affair a secret. Why should I? She had betrayed me, and the world deserved to know the truth. But I wasn't going to air it out in a petty, dramatic way. No, this was going to be calculated. I started with our mutual friends. I reached out to them one by one, explaining the situation in clear, measured terms. I wasn't looking for sympathy, I was setting the record straight. Most of them were shocked, offering support and condemning Rachel's actions. A few tried to play neutral, but I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for validation. Next was William. I debated how to handle him, whether to confront him directly or let the evidence speak for itself. In the end, I decided on the latter. I sent an anonymous email to his company's HR department, attaching the hotel reservation and security footage. I wasn't sure what would come of it, but it felt like a necessary step. Finally, I addressed Rachel's family. This was the hardest part. Her parents had always been good to me, and I knew they'd be devastated by the news. But I wasn't going to let her manipulate them into thinking I was the bad guy. I sat down with them over coffee, explaining everything calmly and honestly. They were heartbroken but supportive, promising to help with the kids during the transition. By the end of the week, the pieces were in place. Rachel was livid, accusing me of turning everyone against her. I didn't deny it. You did this to yourself, I told her. You made your choices. Now you deal with the consequences. She tried to argue, to plead, but I didn't waver. I had spent years bending over backward to accommodate her, to make her happy. No more. As I watched her pack her things into boxes, a strange sense of relief washed over me. This wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it was the life I was reclaiming. Piece by piece, on my terms. Rachel was gone by the end of the week. She had packed her clothes, her toiletries, and most of her personal belongings into boxes and suitcases. It was surreal to watch her leave, dragging the remnants of her life out of the house like she was heading on yet another business trip. Except this time, she wasn't coming back. I thought her departure would bring relief, but it didn't. The silence in the house was heavier than I'd expected. The kids were staying with my sister for a few days. I didn't want them to witness the chaos of their mother moving out, and the emptiness hit harder than I was prepared for. I wasn't ready for the weight of everything. The betrayal, the anger, the sadness. I thought I'd already processed most of it during the confrontation, but the quiet gave my thoughts room to fester. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I started to question if I was handling it the right way. By the time the weekend rolled around, Rachel asked to meet. The email was short and to the point. Adam, I think we need to have one last conversation. Let me know when and where you'd like to talk. I stared at the screen for a long time, debating whether I even wanted to hear what she had to say. But curiosity, or maybe some lingering sense of obligation, got the better of me. I replied with a single line. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., at the house. The kids will still be with Claire. Rachel arrived right on time. She looked different, not in a dramatic way, but enough for me to notice. She seemed smaller somehow, like the weight of everything was finally sinking in. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea I'd offered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "What is it you want to say?" She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine. "I want to understand where we stand," she said softly. "What happens next, for us, for the kids, for everything?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "What happens next is simple. We finalize the divorce, sell the house, and figure out how to co-parent without tearing each other apart. That's all there is to it." She winced at my bluntness but nodded. "I know I've ruined things between us," she said. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness, not now, anyway. I just want to know if there's any chance we can rebuild some kind of trust, even if it's just for the kids' sake." I studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her sincerity. "Trust doesn't rebuild itself overnight, Rachel. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I can ever trust you again, not in the way I used to." Her shoulders sagged, but she didn't look away. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were. But I need you to know that I regret what I did. Every single part of it. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I want you to hear it from me." I nodded slowly, letting her words hang in the air. "I don't doubt that you regret it," I said. "But regret doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase the lies, the betrayal, or the way you shattered this family." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't try to defend herself. "I know," she whispered. "I know I hurt you, Adam. And I know I hurt the kids, even if they don't fully understand what's happening yet. I wish I could take it back. I wish I could undo it all." Her voice broke, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. But you can't," I said firmly. "You can't undo it. All we can do now is figure out how to move forward." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm going to start therapy," she said. "I don't expect it to change your mind about me, but I need to figure out why I did what I did. I need to understand myself before I can even think about being the kind of mother the kids deserve." That caught me off guard. It was the first time since this all began that she'd shown any real self-awareness. "Good," I said simply. "That's a start." The conversation shifted to logistics, when she'd take the kids, how we'd handle school events, birthdays, holidays. It was awkward and painful, but necessary. For the first time in weeks, we spoke like adults, not adversaries. As we wrapped up, she hesitated, as if there was something else she wanted to say. I waited, giving her the space to speak. "Adam," she began, her voice hesitant. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. I took a deep breath, considering my answer carefully. "I don't know," I admitted. "Forgiveness isn't something I can just give right now. Maybe one day, when the anger and the hurt aren't so fresh. But that's not something I can promise." She nodded, her expression a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for being honest." When she left, I felt lighter. Not happy, not relieved, but lighter. Like the weight of unresolved questions had finally been lifted. The path ahead was still unclear, but at least now, there was some semblance of direction. Later that night, I called Claire and told her I was ready for the kids to come home. It was time to start rebuilding, not my marriage, but my life. One step at a time. The first night after Rachel left for good, the house was unnervingly quiet. The kids were back, tucked into their beds after a long weekend with my sister, but the absence of Rachel's presence was palpable. For years, her movements, her habits, and her voice had been a constant in this house. Now it felt like I was walking through a stage set after the actors had all gone home. But as the days passed, I began to adjust. The silence stopped feeling oppressive and started to feel like peace. I could think clearly for the first time in weeks, untangling the mess of emotions Rachel's betrayal had left behind. Anger. Sadness. Confusion. Bit by bit, I began sorting through them, deciding which ones were worth holding on to and which ones I needed to let go. The practical side of moving on came first. I threw myself into preparing the house for sale, clearing out old clutter and touching up the worn edges of what used to be our home. The work was therapeutic in a way. Every stroke of paint and every box packed felt like reclaiming a little more of myself. The kids and I had our routines to re-establish. I focused on them as much as I could, making sure their world felt steady even though the ground beneath us had shifted. They were resilient, as kids often are, but I could see the questions in their eyes, the ones they didn't know how to ask yet. Why did Mom leave? Why aren't things like they used to be? I didn't have all the answers, but I promised myself I'd give them as much honesty as they could handle. About 3 weeks after Rachel moved out, the kids were at school when I received an email from her. The subject line was simple: update. Adam, I wanted to let you know that I've started therapy. It's been hard, but it's helping me see things more clearly. I realize now how much damage I've done, not just to you but to myself and to the kids. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope someday I can show you that I'm committed to being better for them, if not for us. I miss the family we built, and I'll always regret what I've done to it. Please let me know if there's anything I can do to make things easier for you and the kids. Rachel. I stared at the email for a long time before replying. I kept it short. Rachel. Thank you for the update. I'm glad you're taking steps to work on yourself. The kids are doing fine, and I'll let you know if there's anything they need. Adam. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was all I had to give. Life moved on in small increments. The house sold faster than I expected, and the kids and I moved into a smaller place not far from their school. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, a fresh start in a space that didn't hold memories of a fractured marriage. I started reconnecting with old friends, people I'd unintentionally distanced myself from during the later years of my marriage. They welcomed me back with open arms, offering support without prying into the details of what had happened. It felt good to be seen, to be reminded that my world was bigger than the mess Rachel had left behind. The hardest part was figuring out what to do with the lingering bitterness. It wasn't just about Rachel's betrayal, it was about the way it made me question everything I thought I knew. About her. About myself. About what we'd built together. Therapy helped. I resisted it at first, not wanting to admit I needed outside help to navigate my own feelings. But sitting in that office, talking through the wreckage of my marriage, gave me perspective I hadn't been able to find on my own. It wasn't about excusing what Rachel had done or erasing my anger, it was about understanding it, making peace with it, and eventually moving beyond it. Rachel and I settled into a rhythm of co-parenting. It wasn't easy at first. Seeing her at school events or during pickups and drop-offs brought back flashes of everything that had happened. But we kept things civil, for the kids' sake. Over time, the awkwardness eased. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies either. Just two people trying to make the best of a bad situation. The kids seemed to adjust well. They asked questions, of course, questions I answered as honestly as I could without burdening them with details they didn't need. Mom and I both love you, I told them. We just couldn't make things work between us. But that doesn't change how much we care about you. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. One day, months after the dust had settled, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal. The anger. The heartbreak. It had been the worst experience of my life, but it had also forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. Rachel's infidelity wasn't the sole cause of our marriage's collapse, it was the final blow in a relationship that had been slowly crumbling under the weight of unspoken frustrations and unmet expectations. We'd grown apart in ways neither of us had acknowledged, too busy with our own lives to notice the widening gap between us. That didn't absolve her of what she'd done, but it helped me understand it. And in understanding, I found a measure of peace. The last time Rachel and I spoke was at the kids' school play. They'd both landed roles, and we sat together in the audience, watching them perform with pride. Afterward, as we stood in the parking lot, she turned to me and said, "Thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For being fair," she said. "For not making this harder than it already was." I didn't respond right away. Finally, I nodded. We're doing what's best for the kids. That's all that matters. She smiled faintly, then turned and walked to her car. I watched her drive away, feeling a strange mix of emotions, closure, perhaps, but also something softer. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. In the end, life went on. It wasn't the life I'd planned or hoped for, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to live it.